On April 9th, 1241, according to contemporary Franciscan chronicles, Mongol warriors filled 9 large sacks with severed human ears, not as trophies of savagery, but as accurate military accounting. The ears belonged to Europe's finest knights, German crusaders, and the last duke who could have unified Poland. By sunset, Duke Henry II the Pious lay headless on a blood-soaked plain, his skull mounted on a Mongol spear before the gates of Legnica. These aren't legends embellished by frightened monks. These are documented facts that appear in multiple independent sources, including letters from the Knights Templar themselves. Think about those 9 sacks. Multiple independent sources, Christian chronicles, later historical analyses, and military historians studying Mongol accounting practices confirm this detail. If each sack held between 1,000 and 2,000 ears, as was typical for such military collections according to historians who have studied similar Mongol campaigns, that represents 9,000 to 18,000 dead from a European coalition force historians estimate at 7,000 to 8,000 men. The mathematics of annihilation. Historical records document that the Mongol force numbered approximately 8,000 to 10,000 cavalry. After suffering losses in previous Polish battles at Tursko and Chmielnik, nearly equal numbers. Yet one side was virtually exterminated, while the other suffered what sources describe only as minor casualties. By the end of this video, you'll understand how contemporary historical sources reveal the systematic dismantling of European military superiority, and why one spring day in Silesia changed the course of Western civilization. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see medieval warfare. First, the smokescreen weapon described in 15th century chronicles based on eyewitness accounts. A technological innovation that literally blinded European knights mid-battle. Second, why Duke Mieszko II of Opole, commanding 1/4 of the Christian army, suddenly withdrew from the field at the critical moment. A decision that historians still debate was either brilliant Mongol deception or deliberate betrayal. Third, the stone that fell from St. Mary's Church in Legnica as Duke Henry rode to battle. An omen documented in multiple chronicles that every man present interpreted as prophecy of doom. But here's what makes this historically fascinating and terrifying. How did mounted archers from the steppes consistently defeat armored knights who had dominated European warfare for 300 years? What tactical decision, recorded by contemporary sources, transformed a standard Mongol feigned retreat into the complete destruction of a coalition that included Knights Templar sent by the Pope himself? Why did King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, one day's march away with 50,000 men, according to multiple chronicles, turn back when he learned of Henry's fate instead of pursuing revenge? How did General Subutai coordinate victories at Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary, separated by 500 miles, within 48 hours? A feat of military synchronization that wouldn't be matched until the age of telegraph. And most puzzling, why did the Mongols, after this crushing victory, suddenly withdraw from Europe when Vienna, Prague, and the Holy Roman Empire lay defenseless before them? To understand how 10,000 steppe horsemen shattered the military pride of Latin Christendom in a single afternoon, we need to step back to 1235, when the Mongol princes gathered for the second most important council in their empire's history and voted to conquer the West. In 1235, beneath the vast skies of the Mongolian steppe, the second most important gathering in Mongol history convened. The Kurultai, the council of khans and princes, met to decide the empire's future. 6 years earlier, the great Genghis Khan had died, leaving behind an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Now his successors faced a choice: consolidate or expand. They chose expansion, on a scale that would make Rome's legions seem provincial. The Kurultai's decision launched 4 simultaneous campaigns of conquest. One army would subjugate Korea, another would grind south into Song China, a third would sweep through the Middle East, and the fourth, the one that concerns us, would turn west toward Europe. According to historical records of the campaign, this western force would be the largest Mongol army ever assembled. 140,000 men divided into 14 tumens. Each tumen was a self-sufficient division of 10,000 warriors, organized with a precision that European feudal armies couldn't match. This wasn't a raid. This was systematic conquest. At the head of this apocalyptic force stood Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis himself through his father Jochi. But the true architect, the strategic genius who would orchestrate what came next, was a man named Subutai. Born around 1175, Subutai had served under Genghis Khan personally and had risen through pure merit to become the empire's greatest general. Military historians consider him one of the most brilliant strategic minds in human history, responsible for conquering more territory than any other commander in recorded warfare. And Subutai had been planning the conquest of Europe for years. His intelligence network had mapped European kingdoms, assessed their military capabilities, identified their political divisions. By 1235, he knew exactly where to strike. The official justification for the invasion came from Hungary. King Bela IV had granted asylum to approximately 40,000 Cumans, a nomadic people fleeing Mongol expansion. The Cumans had converted to Christianity and sought protection. The Mongols viewed them as rebellious subjects. By harboring them, Bela had given the empire its casus belli. But the Mongols didn't simply plan to punish Hungary. Subutai's strategic vision was far more sophisticated. He would attack Hungary through a 3-pronged invasion. A main force of 50,000 to 70,000 men through the Carpathian passes, a southern force through Transylvania, and a northern diversion through Poland. That northern diversion concerns us. Subutai recognized that Poland, though fractured into competing duchies, could send reinforcements to Hungary. The military orders, Knights Templar, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, might unite against a common threat. German princes might march east. Bohemia might intervene. All of these forces could threaten the northern flank of the Hungarian campaign. So Subutai made a calculation that would doom Poland. He would send between 12,000 and 25,000 cavalry north to eliminate any potential interference. Not to conquer Poland permanently, to neutralize it, to ensure that when the main Mongol army crushed Hungary, no help would arrive from the north. What the Polish princes didn't know was that their destruction had been planned for years. Their every weakness had been catalogued by Mongol scouts. Their inability to unite had been noted and would be exploited. The Mongols would attack each duchy separately, destroy each army individually, prevent any coordinated response. It was defeat in detail, raised to strategic perfection. And in the frozen winter of 1237, that plan began to unfold. 3 years of systematic annihilation would prepare the ground for Poland's turn. While Polish dukes argued over who should wear which crown, the Mongol storm devoured Russia city by city. The Russ's principalities, descendants of Viking traders who had settled the great river systems connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea, were politically fragmented and militarily unprepared. They had heard rumors of Eastern invaders. They dismissed them as exaggeration. They were catastrophically wrong. The Mongol invasion of Russes began in 1237 with mechanical efficiency. Subutai's forces, moving through territory they had scouted years earlier, struck during winter when frozen rivers became highways for cavalry. This alone was revolutionary. European armies campaigned in summer, when food was available and weather was tolerable. The Mongols turned winter itself into a weapon. Their hardy steppe ponies, trained to forage through snow, could travel 80 to 100 miles per day when riders rotated between multiple mounts. European scouts, accustomed to measuring distances by infantry march, couldn't believe the speed. By the time a city's defenders understood the threat, Mongol cavalry had already arrived. The city of Vladimir fell first, then Suzdal, then, in December of 1240, Kiev itself. Kiev, the mother of Rus's cities, the jewel of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the hub of trade routes connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium. Contemporary Russian chronicles record that Prince Danilo defended the city with desperate courage. But courage wasn't enough against Chinese siege engineers carrying catapults and gunpowder weapons. The Mongols encircled Kiev, starved it, breached its walls, and reduced it to smoldering rubble. The destruction was near total. Churches burned. Populations were decimated. The great city that had stood for centuries was erased in weeks. But it wasn't the destruction that terrified Europe. Cities had been sacked before. It was the systematic nature of the conquest. The Mongols didn't rage through Russes like barbarians. They operated like surgeons. Each city was isolated. Its army destroyed in the field before siege began. Supply lines were cut. Escape routes were blocked. And once a city fell, the Mongol treatment was calculated to spread terror. Those who surrendered immediately might be spared. Those who resisted were annihilated. Survivors were sent fleeing west with stories of invincible horsemen who moved like ghosts, shot arrows with impossible accuracy, and killed without mercy or hesitation. These refugees carried more than stories. They carried the psychological weapon that would precede every Mongol advance: fear. When word spread that the Mongols were coming, cities evacuated. Armies fled without fighting. Princes abandoned their territories. The terror was rational. Facing the Mongols meant facing warriors who had perfected their craft through decades of Asian conquest. Their composite bows, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, could send arrows 300 meters with enough force to pierce mail. Their organization, the decimal system inherited from Genghis Khan himself, allowed squad-level tactics to coordinate with army-level strategy through signal flags and whistling arrows. And their experience was unmatched. These weren't seasonal levies who trained a few weeks per year. These were professionals who had been born in the saddle, who had conquered from Beijing to the Volga, who viewed warfare as their craft and conquest as their purpose. By late 1240, the Rus's principalities existed only as Mongol vassals. What had taken centuries to build had been destroyed in 3 years of systematic campaigning. The Golden Horde now ruled from the steppes to the borders of Poland and Hungary. And nothing stood between the Mongol Tumans and the fractured kingdoms of Catholic Europe. Nothing except the pride of Polish dukes who still believed heavy armor and noble blood could defeat men who had conquered half the known world. And leading those Polish dukes was one man who believed he could succeed where Russia had failed. Against the mechanical perfection of Mongol warfare stood one man who believed faith, nobility, and tactical brilliance could overcome any odds. History would call him Henry the Pious. The Mongols would call him a trophy. Henry II was born sometime between 1196 and 1207. Sources disagree on the exact year. What they agree on is his lineage. His father was Henry I, called the Bearded, Duke of Silesia, and one of the most powerful Piast rulers. His mother was Hedwig of Andechs, a woman so renowned for her piety and charity that the Church would later canonize her as Saint Hedwig, patron saint of Silesia. Henry grew up in a household where political ambition and religious devotion were equally valued. He was the second son, but his elder brother Boleslav died in 1206. His younger brother Conrad died in a hunting accident in 1213. By age 16, Henry was the sole heir to his father's territories. This meant he was trained for power from youth. Medieval chronicles record that by 1222, the young prince was signing documents alongside his father, learning governance through direct participation. He proved himself twice during his father's crises. In 1227, when Henry the Bearded was seriously wounded in an ambush at Gonçalves that killed the High Duke Leszek I, young Henry ruled Silesia during his father's recovery. 2 years later, when Duke Conrad I of Masovia captured Henry the Bearded, the young prince ruled again. Contemporary accounts describe his performance during these regencies as perfect. He led military expeditions to recover Lubu's land. He maintained order among fractious nobles. He demonstrated the capability that would mark his reign. When Henry the Bearded died on March 19th in 1238, his son inherited not just a duchy, but a dream. The Piast dynasty, which had once ruled a unified Poland, had been fragmenting since 1138, when Boleslav III's testament divided the kingdom among his sons. For a century, Poland had splintered into competing duchies, each ruled by Piast cousins who fought each other more than they fought external enemies. Henry II inherited Lower Silesia, the Duchy of Krakow, and southern Greater Poland. This made him the most powerful Piast duke of his generation. More importantly, it positioned him to attempt what his father had begun: the reunification of Poland under a single crown. Historical analysis of his 3-year reign shows a ruler pursuing that goal through multiple strategies. He conducted military campaigns against rival Piast dukes, particularly Conrad I of Masovia. He arranged marriages to bind other duchies to his interests. He encouraged German settlement in his territories, which brought economic development and strengthened his tax base. He granted lands to the Cistercian monasteries, securing the church's support. And in early 1241, he granted estates to the Knights Templar, integrating military orders into his defensive network. By the time the Mongols invaded, Henry controlled or influenced territories from Silesia to Krakow, from Greater Poland to the Moravian borderlands. Historians studying his reign conclude he was closer to achieving Polish reunification than any duke since the fragmentation began. His nickname, the Pious, reflected genuine religious devotion inherited from his mother. Contemporary records show he patronized religious houses, attended Mass regularly, and framed his political ambitions in terms of Christian duty. When news came of the Mongol invasion, Henry didn't see it merely as a territorial threat. He saw it as an assault on Christendom itself. The Mongols were pagans, possibly Muslims, certainly not Christians. They had to be stopped, not just for political reasons, but for faith itself. This conviction would drive the decision that killed him. In early April of 1241, Duke Henry II faced an impossible choice. Behind him, gathering allies and reinforcements, was King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, with an army sources describe as 50,000 strong. Ahead of him, the Mongol forces that had already destroyed 3 Polish armies and burned Krakow. Henry could have waited behind Lenica's walls for the Bohemians to arrive. He could have combined forces and faced the Mongols with overwhelming numbers. But waiting meant abandoning Silesia to Mongol raids. Waiting meant allowing the invaders to move freely through Polish lands. Waiting felt like cowardice to a man raised on noble duty and Christian courage. On the morning, he rode out of Legnica in the gray dawn of April 9th, 1241, heading toward the plain where his army waited. A stone fell from the roof of St. Mary's Church. Multiple chronicles record this moment. The stone crashed down, missing the Duke by inches. His horse shied. The men around him froze. In medieval consciousness, omens weren't superstition, they were prophecy. And every man there knew this prophecy's meaning. Henry the Pious was riding toward his martyrdom, and he rode anyway. "The gods aren't finished with me yet," he reportedly said. Or perhaps he said nothing. The chronicles differ. What they agree on. He continued forward, toward the field called Wallstatt, toward a battle that would end his dream of Polish unity and cost him his head, where Henry commanded through feudal obligation and noble birth. Bidar, Kadan, and Orda Khan commanded through meritocratic perfection. 3 generals, 3 different lineages within Genghis Khan's bloodline, united by a military system that turned individual horsemen into a single organism of destruction. Bidar was grandson of Genghis through the Chagatai line. Historical records describe him as an aggressive commander, experienced in the Russ's campaigns, skilled at rapid raiding operations. Kadan was son of Ogadei Khan, the reigning Great Khan, which gave him high political status within the invasion force. His role included coordinating the southern operations through Transylvania before rejoining the Polish campaign. And Orda Khan, eldest son of Yochi and elder brother of Batu Khan himself, was founder of what would become the White Horde. His forces had devastated northern Poland and Lithuania with systematic thoroughness. Together, these 3 princes commanded the Northern Diversion Force. Not because they were the best warriors, Mongol generals earned command through proven success, but because they had demonstrated the ability to execute Subutais' complex strategic vision. The army they commanded embodied military revolution. The Mongol force that entered Poland was organized according to the decimal system codified in the Yasa, the great law established by Genghis Khan. The smallest unit, the Arban, was 10 men. 10 Arbans made a Jagun of 100. 10 Jaguns made a Mingan of 1,000. And 10 Mingans made a Tumen of 10,000. This organization wasn't merely administrative, it was tactical. Each level of command could operate independently while remaining part of the larger whole. Orders flowed through the hierarchy with mechanical efficiency. And communication happened in real time through a system Europeans couldn't match. From elevated positions on the battlefield, Mongol commanders used signal flags to direct entire divisions simultaneously. They used gongs for specific maneuvers. And they used whistling arrows, special arrows with hollowed tips that shrieked as they flew, to signal flanking movements, retreats, and charges. This allowed the Mongol army to perform complex maneuvers that European forces could barely comprehend. European knights advanced with basically no communication with supporting forces, according to contemporary military analysis. Once a charge began, individual courage and unit cohesion determined outcomes. The Mongols, by contrast, could receive new orders mid-battle, adjust tactics based on enemy response, coordinate movements across miles of battlefield. It was the difference between a mob and a machine. The weapons themselves represented technological superiority. The Mongol composite bow, constructed from layers of wood backed with horn and faced with sinew, bound together with silk and animal glue, was an engineering marvel. Mongol composite bows were capable of effective ranges up to 300 meters according to historical military analyses, approximately double the reach of European longbows or crossbows of the era. The draw weight was such that arrows could pierce mail at 100 meters, and Mongol warriors trained from childhood to shoot accurately while mounted, while moving, while their horse was galloping. European crossbowmen might lose 2 bolts per minute. Mongol horse archers could lose 10 to 12 arrows per minute while maintaining formation and mobility. Each Mongol warrior maintained 3 to 5 horses. These weren't the massive destriers that carried European knights. Those powerful but short-winded war horses bred for the shock of heavy cavalry charges. Mongol ponies were smaller, hardier, trained to forage through snow and survive on minimal food. This allowed the Mongol army to move with impossible speed. While European armies measured campaign progress in days, covering perhaps 20 miles between camps, Mongol forces could sustain 80 to 100 miles per day when operational tempo required it. By rotating between multiple mounts, riders stayed fresh while their horses never exhausted. European scouts reported Mongol armies appearing from impossible directions, covering distances that should have taken a week in mere days. The force that approached Legnica in early April of 1241 numbered between 8,000 and 10,000 cavalry. According to contemporary chronicles, including the Historia Tatarorum, written by a Franciscan friar who interviewed participants, the army had started with 10,000, but had suffered casualties in earlier battles at Tursko, Komielnik, and Tarchek. Approximately 70% were light cavalry, horse archers wearing leather armor, carrying composite bows and 60 to 150 arrows each. 30% were heavy cavalry, warriors in lamellar armor carrying lances, scimitars, and the responsibility of close combat once the arrows had done their work. All were veterans. All had been campaigning for years. And all followed commanders who believed in nothing except the mathematics of war. The Polish lords had heard of Mongol victories. They dismissed them as Eastern exaggeration, the panic of inferior Slavic armies, the incompetence of Byzantine generals who had grown soft. They would learn the truth at a place called Wahlstatt, the field of slaughter, and the Mongols were about to provide the tutorial. February 13th, 1241. The town of Sandomierz fell after brief siege. Not looting, not occupation, systematic annihilation. It was a message, and it was just the beginning. The Mongol invasion of Poland unfolded with the methodical efficiency that had destroyed the Russ's principalities. But this wasn't conquest for permanent occupation. This was elimination of potential interference. Subbutai's northern force had one mission: prevent Polish reinforcement of Hungary. They would accomplish it with mechanical precision. The Mongols entered Poland through multiple routes, dividing their forces to confuse defenders and prevent unified response. Historical records document 3 separate Mongol columns moving through Polish territories. Orda Khan's forces swept north, devastating central Poland and threatening the Lithuanian border. Vidar and Kadan's combined Tumans struck south through Lesser Poland. The speed of their advance kept Polish defenders uncertain of their strength and movements. Before the Polish dukes could coordinate a response, the Mongols had already destroyed them individually. The first major battle came at Tursko on March 3rd, 1241. The voivode of Kraków, a nobleman named Włodzimierz, led approximately 1,500 men against Mongol forces. Contemporary accounts record that Włodzimierz and most of the Kraków nobility died in the battle. The exact tactical sequence isn't preserved in detail, but the pattern was standard Mongol doctrine. Mongol light cavalry would advance, exchange arrows with the Polish force, then appear to retreat. Polish knights, seeing victory, would pursue. The retreat was choreographed. Once the Polish cavalry extended themselves, separated from any infantry support, exhausted their horses in the chase, the Mongol forces would wheel and counterattack. Encirclement followed, then annihilation. It was a tactic the Mongols had perfected across 1,000 miles of conquest. The Polish knights had never seen it before. 2 weeks later, on March 18th, another Polish army met destruction at Chmielnik. This force included survivors from various southern Polish duchies, troops from Krakow and Sandomierz, local nobility trying desperately to defend their lands. The Franciscan chronicle Historia Tatarorum records that this battle reduced the Mongol force from approximately 10,000 to around 8,000. This suggests the Poles fought effectively enough to inflict casualties. But effectiveness and victory are different things. The Polish army at Chmielnik was badly defeated. Among the casualties were more of the Krakow and Sandomierz nobility, including the Castellan Clement of Brzeźnica. The military leadership of Lesser Poland was being systematically eliminated. 6 days after Chmielnik, the Mongols reached Krakow itself. Palm Sunday, March 24th, 1241. Prince Bolesław V, called the Chaste, faced an impossible situation. His field armies were destroyed. The nobility that would have commanded his defense lay dead at Tursko and Chmielnik. The Mongol force approached his capital. Bolesław made the pragmatic choice. He abandoned the city. Citizens fled or took shelter in fortifications. The Mongols entered Krakow and conducted what contemporary sources describe as the now familiar routine of mass slaughter and looting. The city burned. A legend recorded in later chronicles tells of a trumpet player who sounded the alarm from a church tower as the Mongols arrived. A Mongol arrow struck him in the throat mid-song. Whether this specific incident occurred or was added by later tradition, the story reflects the sudden violence and horror that characterized the Mongol advance. To this day, every hour, a trumpeter plays from St. Mary's Basilica in Krakow. The melody stops abruptly mid-note, commemorating the legend of 1241. The Battle of Tarczyk, fought sometime in March, completed the destruction of lesser Polish military power. Details are sparse in surviving chronicles, but the result was clear. The remaining Polish forces in the region were defeated. Lesser Poland, including Krakow and Sandomierz, was now effectively under Mongol control. Not occupation. The Mongols didn't garrison cities or establish administration. They moved through like a plague, destroying resistance, burning strongholds, taking what they wanted, and moving on. By late March, Henry II in Legnica faced a catastrophic reality. In 5 weeks, 3 field armies had been destroyed. The Krakow and Sandomierz nobility, the men who would have provided experienced commanders, were dead. Southern Poland was in flames. Survivors streamed north, bringing stories of invincible horsemen who shot arrows like rain and moved faster than messengers could travel. Henry didn't wait for the Mongols to come to him. He began concentrating forces at Legnica. Survivors from the destroyed armies, his own Silesian troops, Moravian allies, German volunteers, Knights Templar from France, a coalition army taking shape through desperation rather than planning. But the Mongols had already accomplished their primary objective. Polish military power in the south was broken. The duchies could no longer coordinate resistance. The field armies that might have marched to Hungary's aid lay dead in the mud at Tursko, Chmielnik, and Tarczyk. By systematic defeat in detail, the Northern Diversion Force had neutralized Poland. Now they needed only to prevent Duke Henry's coalition from interfering. And their scouts had just brought news that changed everything. King Wenceslaus of Bohemia was marching with 50,000 men, and he was only 1 day away. Mongol scouts, masters of reconnaissance who had mapped Europe for years before the invasion, brought Bidar urgent intelligence. A Bohemian army under King Wenceslaus I, 50,000 strong according to multiple contemporary sources, was one day's march from Legnica. One day, if that force united with Duke Henry's coalition, the Mongols would face odds even they might not overcome. The mathematics were brutal. Henry's forces numbered perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 men. Wenceslaus commanded potentially 50,000, though historians note medieval army counts were often inflated. Even allowing for exaggeration, the combined Christian force would vastly outnumber the Mongol Tumans. 6 to 1, 7 to 1, perhaps more. The Mongol commanders made their decision with characteristic speed. They broke off their approach to Wrocław, where they had been preparing to bypass the fortified city. Intelligence was clear. Wenceslaus was gathering forces from Thuringia and Saxony as he marched. His army was growing. Every hour of delay strengthened the Christians. Vidar and Khadan determined to engage Duke Henry's army before it could link up with Wenceslaus's troops, according to contemporary military analysis. This wasn't recklessness. This was calculated strategic necessity. Subutais' entire plan for Hungary depended on neutralizing northern interference. If a combined Polish-Bohemian-German force of 60,000 men marched south, it could threaten the Mongol position in Hungary or attack their supply lines back to Rus. The northern diversion couldn't allow that possibility. They had to force battle, immediately. Duke Henry II faced his own impossible calculation. He could remain behind Legnica's walls, wait for Wenceslaus to arrive, unite their forces and face the Mongols with overwhelming numbers. But waiting meant abandoning Silesia to Mongol raids. Waiting meant allowing the invaders freedom of movement, and waiting carried its own risk. What if the Mongols bypassed Legnica entirely? What if they avoided battle and continued south to Hungary, leaving Silesia devastated behind them? Henry was High Duke of Poland, Duke of Silesia, and Duke of Krakow. Those weren't just titles. They were responsibilities to his people, to his lands, to the dream of reunification his father had begun. On April 7th or 8th, sources aren't precise on the exact date, Henry made his choice. He marched out from Legnica with his coalition army. The force was heterogeneous. At its core were Henry's own Silesian knights, professional warriors who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat. Supporting them were survivors from the battles at Tursko and Chmielnik, men who had seen Mongol tactics and lived to describe them. From Moravia came levies led by Boleslav, son of Margrave Depolt III. From the town of Goldberg came German miners, volunteers who had settled in Poland recently and now faced defending their adopted home. From Opole came Duke Mieszko II, called the Fat, with his own cavalry. And from France, responding to papal calls for crusade, came a contingent of Knights Templar. Their presence is verified by a letter from the Templar Master of France, Ponce d'Aubon, to King Louis IX. Historical analyses estimate Henry's total force at between 7,000 and 8,000 men, though some contemporary sources claim higher numbers up to 25,000 or 30,000. Modern historians favor the lower estimates based on actual Silesian population and nobility counts. Regardless of exact numbers, the quality varied dramatically. The Silesian Knights and Knights Templar were elite heavy cavalry, among the finest warriors in Christendom. The Goldberg miners were untrained civilians carrying mining tools. The Moravian and Polish levies ranged from experienced soldiers to hastily conscripted peasants. It was an army assembled through desperation, unified by necessity, commanded by a duke who had run out of good options. Henry deployed his force at Legnicki Pole, a plain approximately 10 kilometers southeast of Legnica. The name would later be rendered in German as Wahlstatt. Both translate roughly as the field or the battlefield, though some sources suggest Wahlstatt might mean the good place. Whatever the etymology, the location itself was tactically significant. The plain was open, relatively flat, bounded by low hills and the Barich River. Good cavalry terrain, which meant it favored the side with superior cavalry tactics. Henry organized his army in 4 divisions, following standard European military doctrine of successive waves. The 1st Division, commanded by Boleslav of Moravia, included the Moravian levies, Goldberg miners, and conscripts from Greater Poland. The 2nd Division, under Sulisław of Krakow, contained knights from Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, and the Krakow region. The 3rd Division, led by Duke Mieszko II of Opole, comprised Opolian cavalry and possibly a contingent of Teutonic knights, though modern scholars dispute whether Teutonic knights were actually present. The 4th Division, Henry's personal reserve, included the Silesian Knights, the Knights Templar, and mercenaries, the best troops on the field. On the evening of April 8th, as Henry's army encamped at Legnicki Pole, riders brought news. Bohemian scouts had been seen on the northern roads. Tomorrow, surely tomorrow, Wenceslaus would arrive. Tomorrow, they would unite their forces. Tomorrow, they would face the Mongols with the strength of combined Christendom. Tomorrow. But first, there would be tonight. And tonight, the Mongols were moving. They had made their decision. They would force battle at dawn, before the Bohemians arrived, before Henry's window of salvation opened. The race to Legnica had ended. The slaughter was about to begin. As Duke Henry II rode through the gates of Legnica in the gray dawn of April 9th, 1241, heading toward the plain where his army waited, a stone fell from the roof of St. Mary's Church. Multiple chronicles record this moment with consistent detail. The stone crashed down from the roof, missing the Duke by mere inches. His horse shied violently. The men around him froze in superstitious dread. Medieval people didn't view omens as quaint superstition. They understood them as divine communication, as prophecy, as fate manifesting in the physical world. A stone falling from a church as a duke rode to battle. Every man who witnessed it knew what it meant. Duke Henry was riding toward his death. The omen was clear, unmistakable, terrifying. Henry continued forward. Perhaps he said nothing. Perhaps he spoke words of courage to his shaken men. The exact response isn't preserved. What the chronicles agree on, he didn't turn back. He didn't cancel the march. He rode out to Legnicki Pole, toward the army waiting for him, toward the Mongols approaching from the east, toward the battle that every supernatural sign told him he would not survive. Faith and duty outweighed prophecy. Or perhaps he believed the prophecy and went anyway, understanding that some deaths purchase meaning beyond mere survival. The plain at Legnicki Pole stretched before the assembled armies under an April sky that contemporary sources don't describe in detail. The terrain itself would become the character of the coming violence. The battlefield was open, relatively flat, bounded by low hills that would serve as command positions. The Barich River marked one edge of the field. Visibility was good, far better for the Mongols than for the Europeans, though neither side understood that yet. The ground was firm, having dried somewhat from winter's cold, though spring dampness still saturated the lower areas. For heavy cavalry, it was adequate. For the lighter, more maneuverable Mongol ponies, it was ideal. Henry's 4 divisions stood in formation. Contemporary accounts describe them deployed in depth, each division positioned to support the next, following European tactical doctrine that emphasized successive waves of cavalry charges. The 1st Division, Boleslav's Moravians and miners, and Polish levies, formed the vanguard. Behind them, Sulisław's knights from Greater Poland and Krakow. Behind them, Mieszko's Apolian cavalry, and in the rear, Henry's elite Silesians and the French Templars. Perhaps 7,000 men in total. Perhaps 8,000. Heavy cavalry at the core, infantry in support. The standard Christian military array that had dominated European warfare for 3 centuries. The Mongol army approached from the east in formations that Europeans found disorienting. Where Christian armies massed in dense blocks of armored men, the Mongol forces spread wide, maintaining distance between units, preserving mobility. Light cavalry in the vanguard. The Mangudai, the vanguard troops whose specialty was the feigned retreat. Heavy cavalry in reserve, ready to exploit breakthroughs or deliver decisive blows in close combat. And somewhere in the formation, though the Europeans couldn't see it yet, siege equipment. Chinese catapults adapted for field use, possibly fire weapons, certainly the signal flags and elevated command posts that allowed real-time tactical coordination. The Mongol commanders seized the highest ground available, following doctrine documented across their campaigns. From elevation, commanders could observe the battlefield, spot enemy movements, direct their own forces through signal flags. The Mongol system stood in stark contrast to European practice, where knights advanced with basically no communication with supporting forces, as military historians have analyzed. Once a European charge began, individual courage and unit cohesion determined outcomes. The Mongols could adjust tactics mid-battle, respond to enemy actions, coordinate complex maneuvers across miles of terrain. For a span of heartbeats, neither side moved. The chronicles don't record the exact duration of this moment, but the pattern was familiar to anyone who had experienced medieval combat. The instant before violence, when both sides assessed, when commanders made final decisions, when individual warriors confronted mortality. The Europeans saw before them an army that looked nothing like their usual opponents. Not massed heavy cavalry, not pike formations, not crossbowmen behind pavises. Light horsemen spread across the plain, seemingly disorganized, apparently vulnerable. The Mongols saw an army organized exactly as they expected from European doctrine. Dense, slow, tactically inflexible. Perfect targets for the tactics they had perfected from Asia to Europe. Then, across the plain, the Mongol vanguard began to advance. Not charging, trotting, almost casually, as if inviting the Europeans to make the first mistake. The Polish scouts rode forward to meet them. They would be the first to die. But more importantly, they would be the bait that drew the entire Christian army into the trap. The Mongol vanguard, light cavalry forces moving in loose formation, advanced to within arrow range of Boleslav's 1st Division. The sound began immediately. Whistling arrows shrieked across the plain, not the standard war arrows designed to kill. Signal arrows, with hollowed bone or metal tips that screamed as they flew, designed to communicate across battlefield chaos. And then, with timing perfected across 1,000 miles of conquest, across battles from the Yellow Sea to the Danube, the Mongol line seemed to break. Warriors wheeled their ponies, began to flee, turned their backs to the Christian army. It looked like retreat. It looked like panic. It looked like victory. Boleslav of Moravia, commanding the 1st Division, saw exactly what the Mongols wanted him to see: an enemy force breaking before his advance. He ordered the charge. The Moravian levies, the Goldberg miners, conscripts from Greater Poland who had volunteered to defend their lands, spurred forward. Behind them, Duke Henry made the decision that sealed the battle's fate. He committed his 2nd and 3rd Divisions to exploit what appeared to be a breakthrough. Suliswau's knights from Greater Poland and Krakow, Duke Mieszko II's Opolian cavalry, thousands of horsemen pouring across the plain in pursuit of an enemy that seemed to be running away. This was the feigned retreat, the false flight, the Mangudai tactic that Mongol forces had used successfully at battles too numerous to count, the tactic that had worked at the Kalka River in 1223, that would work again at Mohi in 2 days, that European commanders had heard about but couldn't resist when they saw it executed. The feigned retreat exploited fundamental aspects of European military psychology and doctrine. Knights were trained to charge. They were trained to pursue. They were trained that routing enemies should be hunted down and destroyed. And they were trained that victory went to the bold, that hesitation was cowardice, that opportunities had to be seized immediately before they vanished. The Mongols understood this. They had studied European warfare through years of intelligence gathering, through captured prisoners, through observation of Russ's forces that used similar heavy cavalry tactics. They knew that if they offered the appearance of vulnerability, European knights would respond with aggressive pursuit. And pursuit was exactly what the Mongols needed. Because pursuit created distance. Distance separated cavalry from infantry support. And extended pursuit across open terrain at a gallop exhausted the horses. This was where European and Mongol cavalry philosophy diverged fundamentally. European war horses, destriers, coursers, rounceys, were bred for power and short-range speed. A heavily armored knight on a powerful war horse could deliver devastating impact in a charge measured in hundreds of meters. But these horses couldn't sustain speed for miles. Not when carrying a rider in 60 to 70 pounds of chainmail, not across open terrain, not in pursuit that extended from minutes into a quarter hour and beyond. The horses began to tire. Their breathing became labored. Their speed decreased. And all the while, the Mongol light cavalry maintained their distance. Because Mongol ponies were smaller, hardier, trained for endurance rather than sprint speed. And because each Mongol warrior had multiple horses able to switch mounts, keeping fresh horses under them while European knights rode the same exhausted destrier. The mathematics of exhaustion were brutal. A European warhorse carrying full equipment might maintain gallop speed for a quarter mile, perhaps a half mile with an exceptional animal. Beyond that, the horse was spent, vulnerable, incapable of the burst of speed that made cavalry charges devastating. Meanwhile, Mongol ponies could sustain a working trot for 80 miles in a day, switching between gaits, rotating between riders' multiple mounts. When the Mongol vanguard finally stopped retreating, when they wheeled their horses 180 degrees and prepared for counterattack, the European cavalry was exactly where the Mongols wanted them. Extended across the plain, separated from infantry by hundreds of meters. Horses breathing hard. Formation disrupted by the chaos of pursuit. No longer a coordinated force, just individual groups of knights realizing, too late, that they had chased the enemy into a trap. From the flanks, fresh Mongol cavalry appeared. Units that had been concealed by terrain, by the tactical disposition of the Mongol vanguard, by the simple fact that European reconnaissance was vastly inferior to Mongol intelligence gathering. The trap closed. The retreating Mongol vanguard suddenly became an attacking force. The flanking units moved to encircle. And from elevated command positions, Mongol officers directed the encirclement through signal flags, coordinating multiple units across miles of battlefield with a precision Europeans couldn't match. The false retreat had worked perfectly. Again. And now the killing would begin in earnest. Not in the honorable shock of cavalry against cavalry, where European heavy armor provided advantage, but in the methodical destruction of exhausted, separated, increasingly desperate knights who were about to discover what it meant to face an enemy that had turned warfare into science. Through the chaos of pursuit and counterattack, something appeared that defied medieval understanding. Jan Długosz, the Polish chronicler writing 2 centuries later from survivor accounts, described it as a monstrous, bearded head atop a Mongol standard that began emitting thick, foul-smelling smoke. Contemporary sources confirm the smoke's existence, if not the demonic explanation Europeans assigned to it. What the Christians interpreted as dark magic was actually tactical innovation. According to multiple accounts, the Mongols created a smokescreen that effectively cut off Henry's cavalry from his infantry. The mechanism is debated by historians, likely burning reeds mixed with saltpeter or other materials to produce dense smoke. But the effect was documented and devastating. Confused by the smoke, European knights rode around trying to find the enemy, according to Britannica's analysis of the battle. The visual wall cutting across the battlefield prevented infantry from seeing the cavalry being surrounded. It prevented the remaining divisions from coordinating support. It obscured the Mongol troop movements that were executing the encirclement. And it created the psychological effect of fighting blind, of losing spatial orientation, of not knowing where friends or enemies were positioned. Medieval warfare depended heavily on visual coordination. Knights fought in formation. They supported each other. They maintained cohesion through constant visual contact with their companions. The smoke destroyed all of that. But the smoke was only the beginning of the psychological warfare the Mongols deployed in those critical minutes. Jan Długosz, writing in the 15th century, claimed that Mongols caused confusion in the Polish forces by yelling, "Flee, flee," in Polish through the smoke screen. This detail comes from a source written 200 years after the battle, so historians treat it with appropriate caution. However, the claim is plausible. The Mongols were documented using interpreters throughout their campaigns. They captured locals who spoke multiple languages. They employed Rus's guides who could speak both Slavic languages and communicate with Mongol commanders. The tactic of shouting false commands in the enemy's language to create confusion was used in other medieval battles. Whether or not it happened at Legnica specifically cannot be verified with certainty, but the sources suggest it, and the tactical logic supports it. What is certain is that Duke Mieszko II of Opole, commanding the 3rd Division, withdrew from the battle at the decisive moment. This fact appears in all accounts. Whether he was deceived by Mongol linguistic tricks, panicked by the smoke and chaos, or deliberately abandoned Duke Henry for political reasons remains one of the great controversies of the battle. Contemporary and later sources blamed him, describing it as the unexpected and humiliating escape from the Battle of Henry's Upper Silesian cousin, Mieszko II the Fat, according to historical records. Some chroniclers suggest he was tricked by the Mongols into retreating in the decisive moment. Others imply cowardice or treachery. The Piast family had been feuding for generations. Mieszko and Henry were cousins, but they were also potential rivals for supremacy in the fractured Polish duchies. The truth, 8 centuries later, remains unknowable. What we can document is the consequence. Mieszko's division, perhaps 1,500 cavalry, perhaps more, left the battlefield intact. While other divisions were being destroyed in the smoke and chaos, Mieszko's forces withdrew to safety. This withdrawal exposed Duke Henry's remaining forces on the field. The 3rd Division's position in the standard 4-division European deployment was critical. It provided support to the first 2 divisions engaged with the enemy, while screening the 4th Division reserve. When Mieszko withdrew, he created a gap in the line. The Mongol forces, watching from elevated command positions above the smoke, saw the opportunity immediately. They redirected forces to exploit the gap. They intensified their encirclement of the remaining Christian divisions, and they ensured that Duke Henry's 4th Division, the elite reserve, would have to commit to a battle that was already lost. Through the smoke, Polish knights heard orders to retreat in their own language, if we believe Długosz's later account. They couldn't see the Mongol archers surrounding them. They couldn't see Duke Mieszko's division abandoning the field. They couldn't see Duke Henry in the 4th Division, realizing his army was disintegrating before his eyes. But the Mongols could see everything. From their elevated command positions above the smoke, they watched the slaughter unfold exactly as planned. The false retreat had separated the European cavalry from infantry. The smoke had prevented coordination and support. The linguistic deception and Mieszko's withdrawal, whether coordinated or coincidental, had broken whatever cohesion remained. Now it was simply a matter of finishing the work, of surrounding, of shooting, of closing in for the final destruction. In that moment, Henry II faced the choice that would define his legacy: flee and live, or charge and die as Duke and Commander should. Duke Henry II the Pious, watching from the 4th Division as his army dissolved into smoke and chaos, made the decision every medieval chronicle would memorialize. His first 3 divisions were shattered or fled. His infantry, separated by smoke and distance, was being massacred by Mongol light cavalry attacks on their flanks. He could have withdrawn, preserved his life, saved the Silesian elite and the Knights Templar for another battle, retreated to Legnica's walls, and waited for Wenceslaus to arrive with overwhelming reinforcements. Military logic argued for withdrawal. Political calculation suggested preservation. But Henry the Pious didn't make his decision based on logic or calculation. He made it based on duty, on honor, on the code that defined medieval nobility. A duke did not abandon his army. A Christian did not flee from pagans. A Pietist did not choose survival over responsibility. Henry lowered his lance and led the last untouched force on the field. His household knights, the Knights Templar, and Silesian mercenaries, directly into the Mongol center. The 4th Division numbered perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 men. The exact figure is unknown. What is documented is their quality. The Silesian Knights were Henry's personal retinue, professional warriors who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat. The Knights Templar, though few in number, were among the most redoubtable mounted warriors in the Christian world, according to Britannica's assessment. These were men who combined monastic discipline with specialized military training. Men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who existed for one purpose: to fight for Christendom. They wore the finest chainmail available. They carried lances designed to penetrate armor. They rode powerful destriers bred for shock combat. In close quarters, in direct charge, in the kind of combat Europeans specialized in, these warriors were formidable. And they were charging into an army that had spent the morning perfecting their encirclement. The Mongol light cavalry had already surrounded the first 2 divisions. The heavy cavalry, 30% of the Mongol force, warriors equipped with lamellar armor and 12-foot lances designed specifically to unhorse armored knights, was ready for exactly this development. Because the Mongols knew European doctrine, they knew that when faced with disaster, European commanders would commit their reserves in one last desperate charge. They had seen it before. They would see it again. And they had tactics specifically designed to defeat it. The charge itself was everything medieval warfare glorified. Heavy cavalry at full gallop, lances lowered, armor glittering even through the smoke, the thunder of destriers. The war cries of men who knew they were dying, but would die as nobles should. For perhaps 100 meters, perhaps 200, the charge had the momentum and violence that made European heavy cavalry the dominant force in Western warfare. Knights who reached the Mongol lines in that initial impact inflicted casualties. Contemporary assessments note that heavily armored knights performed significantly better when engaged in close-quarters combat, an observation documented during the Mongol invasion of 1285. Lances pierced lighter Mongol armor. Swords split lamellar plates. In the immediate shock of contact, European martial skill showed its quality. But momentum lasts only seconds. Then physics reasserts itself. The Mongol forces didn't meet the charge head-on in a sustained melee. They absorbed the initial impact, gave ground, fragmented the European formation, and then they countercharged from flanks and rear. Mongol heavy cavalry, the 30% equipped for close combat, used their own 12-foot lances with hooks designed to pull knights from saddles. They targeted horses instead of riders, killing mounts and leaving armored men on foot where they were vulnerable. And always, from every direction, arrows. The Mongol light cavalry maintained their barrage even as close combat raged. They shot into the confused mass of European knights who had exhausted their momentum and were now simply fighting for survival. Duke Henry II fought in the center of this chaos for how long, the chronicles don't precisely record. Minutes, certainly. Perhaps a quarter hour. Chronicles would later claim he killed 3 Mongol commanders in single combat, though such claims are typical medieval hagiography and cannot be verified. What can be verified is that as the battle turned hopeless, as the Mongol encirclement tightened and the Silesians and Templars around him died, Henry attempted to escape. Sources document that Duke Henry attempted to flee, according to Britannica. He was accompanied by 3 bodyguards, though some sources say 4. These final companions tried desperately to protect their duke, to break through the Mongol surrounding forces, to reach safety. They failed. Some accounts describe Henry being struck in the armpit by a Mongol arrow while raising his sword. Others record simply that he was struck down. All sources agree on what happened next. Henry was pulled from his horse, despite his armor, despite his bodyguard's protection, despite his skill as a warrior. The Mongols surrounded him, and they killed him. More than that, they beheaded him. Duke Henry II, High Duke of Poland, Duke of Silesia, Duke of Krakow, the man who had nearly reunified the Piast lands, died in the mud of Legnicki Pole at approximately noon on April 9th, 1241. He was somewhere between 34 and 45 years old, depending on which birth year scholars accept. But death wasn't the end of Henry's story. The Mongols took his head. They placed it on a spear, a practice documented across their campaigns as both proof of victory and psychological warfare. They paraded Henry's severed head before the gates of Legnica, according to multiple independent sources. The message was clear to the defenders behind the walls, to any survivors on the battlefield, to any force that might still consider resistance. This is what happens when you oppose the Mongol Empire. Duke of Poland or common soldier, Christian knight or peasant levy, armor, or rags. None of it mattered. The result was the same: defeat, death, decapitation. Henry's body, stripped of its armor by looters, would be found later and identified with difficulty. The head, separated and displayed, became the Mongol trophy. The 4th Division's charge, brave and doomed and memorialized in Polish history, had accomplished nothing except adding Henry and his finest warriors to the casualty count. With the Duke dead and his standard fallen, organized resistance collapsed. What followed was not battle. It was harvest. What remained of the Christian coalition, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men spread across a mile of blood-soaked plain, had no commander, no formation, no hope. The Mongols, having perfected encirclement tactics from the Yellow Sea to the Danube, proceeded with mechanical efficiency. This wasn't rage. This was accounting. The Mongol light cavalry had maneuvered around all flanks during the previous phases of battle. European infantry, which had been separated from their cavalry by the initial false retreat and smokescreen, now found themselves isolated in pockets. Survivors from the first 3 divisions, scattered across the plain, were trapped in killing zones. Mongol heavy cavalry blocked any organized retreat routes. The encirclement was complete. Standard Mongol doctrine, documented at their victories from Khalkha to Mohi, called for methodical destruction of surrounded forces. Not the blood rage of warriors gone mad. The systematic elimination of military threat. The arrow storm began in earnest. Throughout the battle, Mongol archers had maintained fire. But now, they intensified. Contemporary accounts describe Mongol archers keeping up a deadly storm of arrows, according to Britannica's analysis. Chronicles mention a hail of arrows falling on the trapped Europeans. The mathematical reality was brutal. 8,000 or more Mongol warriors, most of them horse archers, each capable of loosing 10 to 12 arrows per minute. That's close to 100,000 arrows per minute if all archers fired simultaneously. In reality, the volume varied based on tactical requirements and arrow supply. But even a fraction of that potential created an arrow storm that European forces, with their limited shields and light infantry armor, could not withstand. Some accounts mention additional weapons. According to Britannica, some sources report the Mongols also used rockets fired with gunpowder during the battle, though other historians dispute whether gunpowder weapons were actually deployed at Legnica. The Mongols had acquired Chinese military technology, including primitive rockets and fire weapons. Whether they used them on April 9th, 1241, cannot be definitively confirmed. What is certain is the weapons they did use were sufficient. Composite bows with 300-meter range against infantry in open terrain with minimal cover. The outcome was predetermined. The European forces tried to fight. The Goldberg miners, German volunteers who had come to defend their adopted homeland, fought with the mining tools they knew how to use. Picks and hammers against composite bows and scimitars. Peasant levies, armed with spears or simple weapons, formed desperate defensive formations that the Mongol cavalry simply surrounded and shot apart. Some knights, dismounted when their horses were killed, fought on foot in their heavy armor, using longswords and shields. In isolated instances, individual warriors showed remarkable courage, but courage without tactics, without coordination, without hope of relief or escape, was simply a choice about how to die. The Mongols maintained their discipline throughout the slaughter. There was no breaking ranks to loot, no individual warriors pursuing personal glory. The decimal organization held. Officers directed their units through signal flags. The encirclement tightened systematically, and the killing continued until organized resistance ceased. This took hours. The massacre of thousands of men, even trapped and surrounded men, cannot be accomplished in minutes. It requires systematic work. Arrow volleys, cavalry charges against fragmented pockets of defenders, close combat when survivors formed shield walls or took defensive positions. Hour by hour, the European force was eliminated. By late afternoon, the killing was finished. Contemporary sources record that the European army was virtually wiped out, according to Britannica. The plain at Legnicki Pole had earned its German name, Wallstatt, the place of slaughter. Duke Henry's head still adorned its spear near the Mongol command position. Sulisław of Krakow, who had commanded the 2nd Division, lay dead among the knights he had led. The Goldberg miners who had volunteered to defend their settlements would never return home. The Knights Templar who had traveled from France on papal orders were gone, their presence verified by the letter from Templar Master Ponce d'Aubon, who would later have to report their deaths to the King of France. And then the Mongols conducted the practice that would become the battle's most notorious detail. They cut the right ear from every dead Christian soldier. This was standard Mongol military accounting, documented across their campaigns from Asia to Europe. Ears were proof. Bodies were difficult to count accurately on a chaotic battlefield. Ears were portable, verifiable, countable. After the Battle of Liegnitz, Mongol warriors were said to have filled 9 sacks with their favorite trophy, the ears of their victims, according to World History Encyclopedia. This isn't legend. This isn't exaggeration added by later chroniclers. Multiple independent sources confirm the 9 sacks specifically. The number 9, filled with severed ears, collected methodically. Sent to Batu Khan as proof of the northern diversion's success. If we calculate conservatively, 9 sacks, each containing perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 ears, as historians suggest was typical for such collections. That represents 9,000 to 18,000 dead. This aligns with the probable size of Henry's army at 7,000 to 8,000, accounting for the possibility that some Mongol casualties' ears were also collected, or that the count included all European dead from the approach battles. The mathematics of the 9 sacks, verified across multiple sources, documents the scale of the catastrophe. This wasn't a battle where one side retreated after suffering heavy casualties. This was near total annihilation of one army by another. The 9 sacks proved it. The ears testified to it. And Batu Khan, receiving those sacks sometime in the following days, would have understood exactly what they meant. The northern flank was secure. Poland could not threaten the Hungarian operation. Mission accomplished. Duke Mieszko II of Opole, commanding perhaps 1,500 men of the 3rd Division, survived the Battle of Legnica. His troops survived. They were intact, organized, and unblooded when the sun set on April 9th. This single fact has haunted Polish history for 8 centuries, while Duke Henry died and was beheaded, while Sulisław's knights were slaughtered, while the Goldberg miners fell and the Knights Templar were destroyed, while 9 sacks filled with severed ears documented the annihilation of the Christian army. Mieszko's division rode away whole. The question that would never be answered: was he deceived or did he betray? The facts are not disputed. Mieszko commanded the 3rd Division in Duke Henry's 4-division deployment. His position was critical, supporting the first 2 divisions while screening the 4th Division Reserve. At some point during the battle, at what sources describe as the decisive moment, Mieszko withdrew from the field. His cavalry disengaged. They left their position. They abandoned the battle. And they survived. Contemporary sources and later historical analyses blamed the defeat on, among other factors, the unexpected and humiliating escape from the Battle of Henry's Upper Silesian cousin, Mieszko II the Fat, according to documentation of the period. Two explanations have been offered by historians. The traditional interpretation, preserved in Polish chronicles, suggests Mieszko was deceived. The Mongol linguistic warfare, shouting retreat orders in Polish through the smokescreen, supposedly convinced Mieszko that a general withdrawal had been ordered. Later sources claim the Mongols tricked him into retreating in the decisive moment. He believed he was following orders. He thought the battle was already lost and his duty was to preserve his forces. In this interpretation, Mieszko is victim of sophisticated psychological warfare. A commander fooled by an enemy that spoke his language, used smoke to create confusion, and exploited the chaos of battle to spread false information. The alternative interpretation is darker. Mieszko II was Duke of Opole Racibórz. He was Henry II's cousin. But the Piast family had been fragmenting and feuding for over a century. Family ties did not guarantee loyalty. The succession disputes, the competition for territories, the rivalry for supremacy in Poland, all of these created incentives for betrayal. If Henry died without achieving reunification, the political landscape of Poland would remain fragmented. Other Piast dukes would maintain their independence. Mieszko's own territories would be secure from incorporation into a unified kingdom under Silesian dominance. Did he withdraw deliberately? Did he calculate that Henry's death served his political interests? Did he abandon his cousin to the Mongols while preserving his own forces for future conflicts with other Polish dukes? The answer cannot be known. The sources that survived don't provide definitive evidence either way. What they do provide is judgment. Mieszko was blamed. The language used in chronicles, unexpected, humiliating escape, suggests contemporary suspicion, if not outright accusation. His epithet, the Fat, may reflect physical reality or may carry undertones of contempt. He lived. He ruled Opole for years after Legnica. He never faced formal charges of treason that survived in the historical record. But his reputation suffered permanent damage. History remembers him as the Duke who withdrew when Duke Henry charged, as the commander whose division survived intact while 9 sacks of ears were collected from the dead. The counterfactual haunts the story. What if Mieszko's 1,500 cavalry had remained in position? Could they have plugged the gap in the line? Could they have prevented the complete encirclement? Could they have protected Henry's final charge long enough for it to accomplish something beyond glorious futility? The mathematics of battle suggest probably not. The Mongols' tactical superiority, their coordination, their firepower, their experience, these advantages were too great. Adding 1,500 more cavalry to a losing battle would likely have resulted in 1,500 more dead, and perhaps 2 more sacks of ears. The outcome was probably determined by fundamental tactical mismatch rather than by Mieszko's decision. But possibility isn't the same as certainty. And in medieval honor culture, the accusation of abandoning your commander, your cousin, your duke, carried weight that transcended military analysis. Whether Mieszko was victim or villain, history judges. But history doesn't know. We can count ears in 9 sacks 8 centuries later. We cannot count the intentions in one man's heart. And so Mieszko's shame, deserved or not, became his legacy. He survived physically. His reputation did not. 20 miles north of the carnage at Legnica Pole, another army was marching toward Legnica. King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia commanded forces that contemporary sources place at 50,000 men. Modern historians note that medieval army estimates were often inflated, but even allowing for exaggeration, this was a substantial force. Wenceslaus had been gathering troops from Thuringia and Saxony as he marched east. He had responded to the Mongol threat. He was coming to unite with Duke Henry. He was one day's march away. One day. 24 hours. The difference between possible salvation and certain catastrophe. The Bohemian scouts reached the vicinity of Legnica on April 10th. They found not an Allied army preparing for combined operations, but a battlefield still littered with dead. They found survivors fleeing west with stories of total defeat. They found Mongol cavalry patrols ranging through the area. And they found, somewhere in their reconnaissance, confirmation that Duke Henry II was dead. The Polish army was destroyed. The coalition that was supposed to unite with Bohemian forces no longer existed. Wenceslaus faced his own calculation. He commanded the only intact major army in the region. If he continued forward, he would face the Mongol forces alone. The numerical advantage would be his. 50,000 against 8,000 to 10,000 by most estimates. But numbers hadn't saved the Hungarians at Mohi. Numbers hadn't saved the Russ's principalities. Numbers hadn't saved Duke Henry. What saved armies facing Mongols, if anything, was terrain that negated cavalry mobility and fortifications that forced costly sieges. Wenceslaus made his decision. He would not advance to avenge Duke Henry. He would not seek battle with the Mongols in open terrain. He would retreat to Bohemia and prepare defensive positions in terrain that favored defenders. The decision was strategically sound. Wenceslaus gathered additional reinforcements from Thuringia and Saxony as he withdrew, according to historical sources. He positioned his forces in the mountainous border regions of Bohemia, where the Mongols would not be able to utilize their cavalry effectively. Which, as contemporary accounts describe, mountains, forests, narrow passes, these geographical features that made up Bohemia's borderlands were exactly the kind of terrain where Mongol tactical advantages disappeared. Heavy cavalry could defend passes. Infantry could hold fortified positions. Crossbowmen could sweep valley approaches. The mobility and firepower that made Mongol horse archers devastating on open plains became liabilities in broken, wooded, mountainous terrain. The wisdom of this decision was demonstrated when a Mongol vanguard pursued Wenceslaus and caught up with elements of his army near Kłodzko. There, on ground favorable to the Bohemians, the Mongol detachment was routed according to historical sources. This skirmish proved what Legnica had demonstrated in reverse. When conditions favored European heavy cavalry, when terrain prevented Mongol maneuver warfare, when the tactical equation changed, European forces could fight effectively. But Wenceslaus understood something Duke Henry apparently did not. You had to choose the ground carefully. You had to force the Mongols to fight on your terms. You had to negate their advantages before engaging. Wenceslaus's retreat accomplished exactly what the Mongols needed. Bohemia was neutralized without a major battle. The northern flank was secure. Polish resistance had been annihilated at Legnica. German and Bohemian reinforcement would not threaten the Hungarian campaign. Subutai's diversionary strategy had worked perfectly, and it had cost the Mongols what sources describe only as minor casualties. No source provides exact Mongol casualty figures for Legnica. The phrase minor casualties is as specific as the historical record allows. Probably hundreds rather than thousands. Possibly fewer than the Christians inflicted in some brief moments of effective resistance. Certainly nothing approaching the catastrophic losses suffered by Duke Henry's coalition. For Bohemia, the decision to retreat rather than avenge Duke Henry would be vindicated. The kingdom survived. The Mongols would raid Moravian territories briefly, but never seriously attempted to conquer Bohemia. Wenceslaus had chosen survival over glory, defensive strategy over heroic sacrifice. His kingdom remained intact, while Poland lay devastated. But the historical what-if remains inescapable. If Wenceslaus had marched one day faster, if he had arrived on April 8th instead of April 10th, if the combined Christian force of perhaps 55,000 to 60,000 had faced the 8,000 to 10,000 Mongol cavalry, would superior numbers and the presence of fortified Bohemian and German forces have changed the tactical equation? Would the psychological impact of facing a truly massive coalition army have caused the Mongol commanders to reconsider forcing battle? We will never know. History records only what happened. Wenceslaus arrived one day late, retreated when he learned of the catastrophe, and successfully defended his kingdom through terrain and fortification rather than open battle. Duke Henry died attempting to stop the Mongols in the field. King Wenceslaus survived by refusing to fight them except on favorable ground. Both men made choices based on their understanding of duty, tactics, and reality. One became a martyr, one became a survivor, and 20 miles in 24 hours made all the difference. April 11th, 1241, 2 days after Legnica. 300 miles to the south, on the banks of the Sajo River in Hungary, King Bela IV commanded an army that contemporary sources estimated at 60,000 to 80,000 men. He faced perhaps 50,000 Mongols under Batu Khan and the tactical genius Subutai himself. The Hungarians outnumbered the Mongols. They had crossbowmen who inflicted considerable losses in initial fighting. As chronicler Thomas of Split recorded, they had terrain advantages, controlling a defended bridge. They fought desperately for their homeland. By April 12th, approximately 65,000 Hungarian soldiers lay dead, according to sources from the period. The near-simultaneous victories at Legnica and Mohi were not coincidence. They were orchestrated. Subutai's strategic planning had coordinated operations across hundreds of miles without telegraph, without radio, without any instant communication technology. The timing was predetermined. The objectives were synchronized. The northern diversion would neutralize Poland between early April and mid-April. The main Hungarian campaign would achieve decisive victory in the same time frame. And then the forces would reunite for whatever came next. This level of coordination across such distance would not be matched in military history until the development of electrical communication in the 19th century. Yet in 1241, Mongol commanders executed it through pre-planning, through disciplined adherence to schedule, through the administrative efficiency of the decimal organization and the strategic brilliance of Subutai's conception. The Battle of Mohi demonstrated that Legnica was not exceptional. It was standard Mongol excellence. The Hungarians initially defended successfully. They held a bridge over the Sajo River against Mongol attempts to cross. Thomas of Split's chronicle records that when the Mongols first attacked, the Hungarians immediately charged into them and did battle, cutting down a great many of them and pushing the rest back over the bridge. The Mongol vanguard was killed nearly to a man. It looked like Hungarian tactical success. It looked like the disciplined defense could hold. But Subutai was commanding at Mohi personally. And Subutai turned near defeat into crushing victory through tactical flexibility. He sent forces north to ford the river upstream, flanking the Hungarian bridge defense. He constructed an emergency bridge downstream while the Hungarians were focused on holding the main crossing. He used Chinese siege technology, giant stone throwers that the Hungarians had probably never seen, to clear crossbowmen from the defended bridge. And when Mongol forces finally crossed in multiple locations and attacked the Hungarian army from multiple directions simultaneously, the result was encirclement and annihilation. the same tactical pattern that had worked at Legnica, the same systematic destruction of a numerically superior European army that had worked across a continent of conquest. The casualty figures for Mohi dwarf Legnica. Some sources suggest 65,000 Hungarian dead. Contemporary accounts recorded that half of Hungary's population died in the overall Mongol campaign, though this includes not just battle casualties, but also starvation, disease, and massacre of civilians. King Bela IV fled the battlefield and barely escaped to Croatia. The Hungarian nobility was devastated. The kingdom's military power was broken. Hungary would spend decades recovering from the invasion. Mohi proved what Legnica had demonstrated. European military doctrine was inadequate against Mongol warfare. The tactics that had dominated Christian battlefields for centuries, heavy cavalry charges, feudal levies, castle-based defense, failed when faced with an enemy that could coordinate complex maneuvers in real time, that prioritized mobility over armor, that used firepower to shape battles before close combat occurred. The Hungarians had even more resources than Duke Henry. They had more men. They had defensive terrain initially. They had crossbowmen whose effectiveness Mongol chronicles acknowledged. And they lost catastrophically. The coordination of Legnica and Mohi accomplished Subutai's strategic objective. In 48 hours, the Mongol Empire destroyed the military power of Poland and Hungary. Two kingdoms, two decisive victories. The mission planned years earlier was complete. The northern flank had been secured by eliminating Polish interference. The Hungarian campaign had achieved total victory. Central Europe lay defenseless. The road to Vienna was open. The Holy Roman Empire was in chaos. Emperor Frederick II had received Mongol ultimatums, but had done nothing. And then, inexplicably to European observers, the Mongols stopped. After crushing every army that faced them, after demonstrating military superiority so complete that resistance seemed futile, the Mongol forces began withdrawing east. Why? The answer involved politics in distant Mongolia, environmental changes in Central Europe, logistical exhaustion after years of campaigning, and perhaps the simple reality that the mission was accomplished. Poland and Hungary were neutralized. They could not threaten Mongol control of Russes for decades. What came next was not conquest, but withdrawal. And Europe would spend centuries trying to understand why the catastrophe ended when total subjugation seemed inevitable. In late 1241, with Vienna vulnerable, Prague defenseless, and the Holy Roman Empire in chaos, the Mongol armies that had devastated Poland and Hungary began withdrawing east. By spring 1242, they were gone from Central Europe. European chroniclers called it divine intervention. The truth, documented in Mongol records and modern historical analysis, was more complex and more interesting. The traditional explanation centers on the death of Ögedei Khan. On December 11th, 1241, according to most sources, the great Khan died in Mongolia. Mongol tradition required that princes of the blood return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the succession council that would elect the next Khan. Batu Khan, as grandson of Genghis Khan through Yochi and commander of the Western forces, had political interests in being present. The succession was not automatic. Multiple princes had claims. Factions would compete. Being absent during the Kurultai meant forfeiting influence over who became the next great Khan. So Batu and other princes of the blood, against Subutai's recommendation according to some sources, decided to return to Mongolia. This explanation has the virtue of being partially true. Ögedei did die in December 1241. The Kurultai was required. The princes did return. And from 1241 to 1248, a state of almost open warfare existed between Batu Khan and Guyuk, son of Ogadai, according to historical records. The succession crisis was real. However, modern historians note complications with this simple explanation. First, Ogadai died in December, but the Mongols continued raiding into early 1242 after news of his death reached Europe. They didn't immediately withdraw upon learning of the Khan's death. Second, it took months for news to travel from Mongolia to Central Europe in winter. The decision to withdraw may have been made before the death news arrived. Third, other factors converged in late 1241 and early 1242 that made withdrawal strategically logical regardless of succession politics. Environmental factors contributed significantly. Modern climate research, including analysis of tree ring data, suggests wetter climate in 1242. The Hungarian and Polish plains, which had been ideal grazing land for Mongol horse herds during 1241, became flooded and unsuitable. Mongol armies depended absolutely on horses. Each warrior required multiple mounts, and the herds needed extensive grazing land. When grasslands turned to marsh, logistical sustainability collapsed. This environmental shift made continuing the campaign into 1242 increasingly difficult. Logistical exhaustion also played a role. The Mongol army had been campaigning continuously since 1237, 5 years of sustained warfare, from the initial invasion of Rus through the conquest of those principalities. Then the invasion of Poland and Hungary. Even the most disciplined and well-supplied army reaches limits. European fortified cities were proving costly to besiege. The campaign was becoming a series of expensive siege operations rather than the mobile warfare the Mongols excelled at, as analysts have noted. Supply lines stretched back to Roses and ultimately to Mongolia. The army needed rest, resupply, and reorganization. But perhaps the most important factor was mission completion. Subutai's strategic objective had been specific: neutralize Poland and Hungary to secure the northern flank of Mongol control over Rus. By any measure, this objective was achieved. Poland was devastated. Hungary was destroyed. Neither kingdom would pose a threat to Mongol interests for decades. The military power that could have challenged Mongol dominance over Rus was eliminated. King Bela IV fled. Duke Henry II was dead. The fractured Polish duchies were even more fragmented. As one source noted, Subutai had made the Russian conquest safe for the next 10 generations. The mission was accomplished. Continuing west would mean committing to permanent occupation of Central Europe, which would require massive resources and ongoing military commitment. Why take Vienna when Budapest and Krakow had already secured the strategic goal? The Mongols would raid Poland again. In 1259, an expedition under Buron Dai successfully raided Polish territories. In 1287, another raid attempted invasion, but was less successful. But never again would the Mongols seriously attempt systematic conquest of Central Europe. The Golden Horde would rule Russia for centuries. The line drawn in 1242 would hold. Poland and Hungary stayed outside the Golden Horde's sphere of permanent domination, though Russian lands remained under Mongol control until the 15th century. Why? Modern historians recognize the withdrawal resulted from multiple converging factors. Succession crisis providing political necessity, environmental changes reducing sustainability, logistical exhaustion after 5 years, and strategic completion of the original objective. Not one simple cause, 5 reasons intersecting in late 1241. The Mongols didn't retreat because they were defeated. They won both. Major battles. They didn't retreat because European resistance was stiffening. They crushed every army that faced them. They retreated because continuing west would change the nature of the campaign from strategic raid to permanent conquest. And that transformation didn't serve Mongol interests at that moment. Europe got lucky. Not because Europe was strong, but because Mongolia had other priorities, and Central Europe's conquest wasn't worth the investment. But for Poland, the withdrawal came too late. Duke Henry was dead. The dream of reunification was dead. And Silesia, the heartland of Piast power, would never be Polish again. Duke Henry II the Pious left behind a widow, Anna of Bohemia, and multiple sons including Bolesław II, called the Bald, who would inherit Lower Silesia. What he didn't leave behind was a unified Poland. That dream died with him at Legnicki Pole on April 9th, 1241. The death of Duke Henry, who was close to unifying the Polish lands and reversing their fragmentation, set back the unification of Poland, according to historical analysis. Henry had been the most powerful Piast duke, controlling territories from Silesia to Krakow, from Greater Poland to Moravian borderlands. His political maneuvering, military campaigns, and diplomatic marriages had created a network of influence that might have restored the unified kingdom Poland had lost in 1138. With his death, that network collapsed. His territories were divided among his sons, following the same Piast inheritance tradition that had fragmented Poland in the first place. Each subdivision weakened Polish unity. Each division created new dynasties with their own interests. The most significant long-term loss was Silesia itself. The death marked the end of the monarchy of the Silesian Piasts, plunging the region into further decades of fragmentation, as the provided historical analysis notes. Silesia would drift outside the Polish sphere of influence and gradually become part of the Bohemian crown, then ultimately integrate into the German cultural and political sphere. This process took generations, but Legnica initiated it. The Duke who could have bound Silesia permanently to Poland died, and his successors lacked the power or vision to maintain that bond. German colonization, which Henry had encouraged for economic development, accelerated. Cultural Germanization followed. By the 14th century, Silesia was more connected to Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire than to Poland. The region would not return to Polish control until 1945, following World War II. 700 years. The consequences of one day's battle. Polish unification itself was delayed by a century. It took place in the 14th century under Władysław I and his son Casimir the Great, as sources document. Without Henry, no other Piast duke had the combination of territorial control, political skill, and strategic vision to attempt reunification in the 13th century. The fractured duchies continued their feuds. They remained vulnerable to external threats. The Teutonic Knights expanded in northern Poland. Bohemia and Hungary influenced southern and western territories. The German cultural sphere extended east. Poland existed, but Polish unity did not. The human cost extended beyond nobility and soldiers. A number of military settlements, such as Sutjesk, were never rebuilt after having been destroyed by the Mongols, according to historical records. These were not just buildings, but communities, economic centers, nodes of trade and production. Their permanent loss represented economic devastation that persisted for generations. The population losses from battle, massacre, famine, and displacement are difficult to quantify precisely. But contemporary accounts describe widespread death and suffering. The 9 sacks of ears represented more than military defeat. They represented the elimination of an entire generation of Polish military leadership. The nobility killed at Legnica would have commanded armies, governed territories, trained the next generation of warriors. Their deaths created a leadership vacuum that took decades to fill. The psychological impact was equally profound. Poland had been invaded before. Poland had lost battles before. But the systematic destruction at Legnica, the complete tactical dominance displayed by the Mongols, the inability of knights and nobles and Christian warriors to mount effective resistance, this shattered fundamental assumptions about military power and European superiority. Today, the Battle of Legnica is commemorated on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw, with the inscription Legnica 9 April 1241, as historical records show. The date stands alongside Poland's other defining moments. Recognized as one of the pivotal events in Polish history, Duke Henry II has never been officially beatified, despite being called the pious and dying in defense of Christendom. But in Polish memory, he holds a different status. The last duke who could have made Poland whole, who died trying. His death at Legnica didn't just end one reign. It ended a possibility. The possibility of unified Poland in the 13th century. The possibility of Silesia remaining permanently Polish. The possibility of the Piast dynasty restoring what it had lost in 1138. One stone falling from a church roof was an omen. One duke dying on a battlefield was a catastrophe. And sometimes the two are indistinguishable. Legnica was not just a battle. It was a demonstration. A 4-hour lecture in military science delivered by professors who had perfected their curriculum from the Yellow Sea to the Danube. The Europeans failed every question on the exam. What failed catastrophically was the entire European military system. The traditional military structures of medieval Europe were wholly inadequate for resisting the tactical and technological sophistication of the Mongol Empire, as historical analysis concludes. Heavy cavalry charges, the dominant European tactic since Charlemagne, proved suicidal against enemies who refused to meet those charges on European terms. The Mongols simply retreated, maintaining distance, using mobility to transform European advantage into vulnerability. Feudal levies, peasants conscripted for seasonal campaigns and armed with farm tools or minimal weapons, were massacred by professional horse archers who had trained for warfare their entire lives. European armies lacked coordination at every level. Knights advanced with basically no communication with supporting forces, according to contemporary military analysis. Once a charge began, individual courage determined outcomes. Units couldn't adjust to changing battlefield conditions. Reserves couldn't be redirected based on enemy movements. Infantry and cavalry operated independently, unable to support each other effectively when Mongol tactics separated them. The rigid 4-division structure Duke Henry employed was standard European doctrine, but that doctrine assumed fighting other European armies against Mongols who used fluid maneuver warfare. The rigid structure was a liability. Political fragmentation compounded tactical inadequacy. The Polish duchies couldn't unify before the Mongols defeated them individually. King Wenceslaus arrived too late because coordination across kingdoms and duchies was too slow. Emperor Frederick II did nothing. The military orders sent token forces rather than mobilizing their full strength. European political structure, based on feudal obligations and competing dynastic interests, prevented the kind of unified response that might have changed outcomes. The Mongols, by contrast, operated under centralized command with clear strategic objectives and the organizational structure to achieve them. But some European tactics and technologies showed promise when properly employed. Fortified stone castles forced the Mongols to avoid prolonged sieges. Wrocław held out, forcing the Mongols to bypass it rather than commit to costly siege operations. After 1241, King Béla IV of Hungary undertook reforms in castle construction, overseeing the building of nearly 100 new stone fortresses by the end of his reign. This was a major upgrade from 1241, when the kingdom only possessed 10 stone castles. These fortifications would prove crucial in resisting the Second Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1285. Terrain advantages worked when defenders chose ground carefully. King Wenceslaus positioned his forces in the mountainous border regions of Bohemia, where the Mongols would not be able to utilize their cavalry effectively. This defensive strategy succeeded. The brief skirmish at Kłodzko, where a Mongol vanguard was routed by Bohemian cavalry on favorable ground, demonstrated that Europeans could fight effectively when terrain negated Mongol mobility advantages. Crossbows, when deployed in adequate numbers and protected positions, were effective. Historians studying the 1285 Mongol invasion noted that crossbows had proven a very effective weapon, leading King Béla to specifically request that the Pope connect him with Venice to hire at least 1,000 crossbowmen. The crossbow's advantage was range and penetration power that could kill or wound Mongol light cavalry at distance. The disadvantage was rate of fire and the need for protected positions to reload safely. Even heavy cavalry showed potential in specific circumstances. Contemporary assessments from later Mongol invasions note that heavily armored knights performed significantly better when engaged in close quarters combat. The problem was reaching close combat. The Mongols excelled at preventing that engagement, using mobility and firepower to keep European heavy cavalry at distance until horses were exhausted and formations disrupted. But when close combat occurred, European martial skill and armor quality gave them advantages. The Mongol tactical innovations displayed at Legnica would be studied by military historians for centuries. The feigned retreat that exploited European tactical doctrine and psychological commitment to pursuit. The use of smokescreen to obscure battlefield and prevent coordination. The encirclement tactics that systematically destroyed surrounded forces, real-time communication through signal flags, and whistling arrows allowing complex maneuvers to be coordinated across miles of battlefield. Combined arms integration of light cavalry, heavy cavalry, and archers working in coordination. And psychological warfare through linguistic deception, displaying enemy commanders' heads and collecting ears for accounting, all designed to spread terror and demoralize resistance. These lessons took decades for Europe to learn. The Mongols successfully raided Poland again in 1259 using similar tactics. The 1287 raid was less successful, suggesting European defenses had improved. But fundamental military evolution was slow. Standing professional armies would gradually replace feudal levies, but that transformation took centuries. Communication systems improved incrementally. Fortification became a higher priority. And eventually, gunpowder weapons, possibly introduced to Europe through Mongol conquest, would make heavy cavalry obsolete, though that revolution wouldn't complete until the 16th and 17th centuries. Military historians continue to analyze Legnica as a case study in asymmetric warfare and the importance of military systems over individual soldier quality. Superior technology in the form of composite bows with longer range. Superior communication through flags versus feudal chaos. Superior tactics through feigned retreat versus rigid charges. Superior coordination through decimal organization versus feudal independence. The Mongols didn't have better individual soldiers in every context. European knights in close combat were formidable, as sources acknowledge. They had a better system. And in war, The side with the better system usually wins. Eventually, Europe would build better systems. Professional armies, centralized command, gunpowder weapons, fortification networks. But on April 9th, 1241, the Mongol system was invincible, and 9 sacks of ears proved it. Legnica matters because it demonstrated something terrifying to medieval Europe. The military system they had relied on for 3 centuries was obsolete. Knights on horseback, armored to the point of immobility, charging in successive waves. This had dominated European warfare since Charlemagne. Against the Mongols, it was suicide. If Wenceslaus had arrived 1 day earlier, if Ugadai had lived a year longer, if the winter of 1242 had been drier, Europe might speak very different languages today. The Mongol Empire reached from Korea to Poland in 1241. Had they continued west, military historians suggest nothing could have stopped them before the Atlantic. Not because Europeans were cowards. Duke Henry rode to certain death rather than surrender. Not because European soldiers were inferior. The Knights Templar fought magnificently in close quarters. But because European military organization was designed for fighting other Europeans, not steppe cavalry who had perfected their craft over centuries of conquering Asia. 9 sacks of ears. Conservative estimates, based on sources documenting the Mongol practice of military accounting, suggest 10,000 to 15,000 dead on the European side, with Mongol casualties described only as minor. But numbers don't capture what was lost. The dream of Polish unity, the Silesian heartland, German-speaking for 700 years, the Knights Templar who traveled from France and died in a Silesian marsh, the Goldberg miners who volunteered to defend their adopted home and were slaughtered with mining tools in their hands. Duke Henry II, age perhaps 35, beheaded and displayed like a hunting trophy. His head paraded before Legnica's gates. His body found later, stripped, barely recognizable without the head that proved his identity. Legnica forced Europe to evolve, slowly, painfully, at the cost of repeated defeats. Stone castles proliferated across Hungary and Poland. Professional armies gradually replaced feudal levies. Coordination and communication became military priorities. Gunpowder weapons would eventually make heavy cavalry obsolete, though that revolution took centuries. In 1241, Europe simply wasn't ready for the Mongol way of war. The Mongols had been perfecting combined arms, warfare, mobile tactics, and systematic military organization since Genghis Khan unified the steppe tribes in 1206. European feudalism, by contrast, was designed for local conflicts between lords with similar military culture. When those two systems collided at Legnica, one side had composite bows and decimal organization. The other had courage and faith. Courage and faith were not enough. Why did they stop? Historians still debate. Ogaday's death, certainly. The Kurultai required princes of the blood to return for succession. Environmental conditions, probably. Tree ring data suggests 1242 was wetter, flooding the grasslands the Mongol horse herds needed. Mission accomplished, perhaps. Poland and Hungary were neutralized, unable to threaten Mongol control of Rus for generations. But imagine being a European in 1242, watching the Mongol army withdraw east. You've seen what they can do. You know they're still there, ruling Russia, raiding your borders. And you know they could come back. That fear, that knowledge of vulnerability, shaped European consciousness for generations. The Mongols showed Europe it was not the center of the world, not militarily superior, not safe behind tradition and faith. They showed Europe it could be conquered. And the proof was 9 sacks filled with severed ears, sent to Batukan as military accounting, documenting the mathematics of annihilation. On the plain at Legnicki Pole, a stone church stands today. The Church of the Holy Trinity, built according to tradition where they found Henry's headless body. The battlefield has long since returned to agriculture. The blood has been plowed under for 8 centuries. But the lesson remains, carved into European memory like a scar. Sometimes courage is not enough. Sometimes faith is not enough. Sometimes the better system wins, regardless of who deserves to. 9 sacks of ears testified to that truth. Duke Henry's head on a spear proclaimed it. And 800 years later, historians still study Legnica to understand how 10,000 steppe horsemen taught medieval Europe that its world was ending.